Okay, so good morning. This is the 21st class in Touching a City's Soul, this book, which is a compilation of the teachings of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, when he visited Chicago in 1942. And we're up to page 100. We're about to start the second mimer that is recorded in this sefer, in this book. As we mentioned before, there's different talks and actually we're going to get to some memoirs that people who were there are going to share and so on. But we are actually, what we're doing right now is the second mimer. We did a mimer already, and now we're up to the second mimer, which again starts on page 100. So if people have the book in front of them, feel free to open up to page 100, and that's where we are. I will read. So this mimer was said on the 10th of Shvat, and the 10th of Shvat actually was the yard site of his grandmother, Rebbe Rivka. So he's going to mention that, but it also wound up becoming his own yard site a few years after this. So just to keep that in mind, I guess. So since he mentions at the beginning of the mimer that it's the yard site of his grandmother, we assume that this mimer was like also said in her honor, kind of a thing. So then on page 100, the mimer of Yud Shvat Tavshin Bais. Okay, so the yard site of my real grandmother, the righteous Rebbe Rivka, may her soul rest in Gan Eden, may her merit protect us. So again, just a word about Rebbe Rivka before we start the actual mimer. We've mentioned her in other classes that she was a Rebbetzin who really spanned the lifetime of pretty much all of the Chabad Rabbeim, because she was the granddaughter of the Alter Rebbe. She was married to the Rebbe Marash, raised by the Mitzvah Rebbe, married Mitzvah Rebbe's grandson, was the mother, the wife of the Marash, the mother of the Rashab, and the grandmother of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And his father, the Rebbe Rashab, told the Frierdiker Rebbe to go and sit by Rebbe Rivka's feet, basically, and learn and hear all the stories of the Chabad Hasidim and the history of Chabad and so on. And a lot of what we have today is based on those conversations. The Rebbe Rashab also gave a directive to the previous Rebbe to write down all the stories that he heard. So they weren't necessarily only from Rebbe Rivka, but that's also why we have such a wealth of information, really. The Chabad school systems, Bais Rivka in New York, Bais Rivka in Paris, are named after Rebbe Rivka, or in her memory. And she was a very righteous woman in her own right. And as we said, her yard site is the 10th of Shvat. Now, as I said in the email, this mimer is going to talk about davening, and the Rebbe is going to start with a quote from Brachos that is translated in one way, and then he's going to explain it sort of on a deeper level. What does it mean on a deeper level? So, as with every mimer, which is based on a verse from Torah or a quote from the Talmud or something like that, this is the quote from the Talmud that it's talking about. So it says, one should not stand up to pray unless he is in a state of kavod rosh, from the Mishnah. So as you see, Brachos 5:1. So what does that mean, kavod rosh? That's what we're going to be talking about. What does it mean that one should not stand up to daven? And in English it sounds awkward. In Ein L'Spal means basically don't pray. Don't pray, not stand up to pray is like a literal translation of it, unless the person's in a state of kavod rosh. So as he says, we need to understand what is meant by kavod rosh. If we're supposed to have this attribute before we start davening, what is it? What are we supposed to inculcate in ourselves before we start davening? And the literal translation, as he says here, is heaviness of the head. So what does that mean, heaviness of the head? It does not mean a headache. That's not necessary before we start davening. So what does heaviness of the head mean? I mean, we do have an opposite term in Hebrew, which we also have in English, called lightheaded, right? In Hebrew, you have kalus rosh, lightheaded, and you have kavod rosh, heavy-headed. In English, you only have lightheaded, which can mean frivolous, not just dizzy, right? On a medical level can mean dizzy, but on a sort of a experiential, emotional level can mean frivolous, right? So it is going to be something like the opposite of being frivolous, basically. Spoilers alert. Okay, so what does this mean? So Rashi explains, Rashi is one of the foremost commentaries on both the Chumash, the written Torah, and the Talmud, the Gemara. He lived about 1100 of the Common Era. So Rashi explains that kavod rosh means submissiveness. Hachna'a is the term that Rashi uses, and humility or lowliness, shiflus. Hachna v'shiflus. Those are the two terms in Hebrew, which also at first glance, they could seem like they mean the same thing. Of course, the maamarim is going to discuss that they are actually two different things. If they were exactly the same thing, then Rashi would not use two different terms. He would just use one of them. But Rashi wants us to understand that we should develop both of these ideas, both of these qualities in us before we start to daven, and therefore he uses both of these terms. They're not just a repeated term. And this is true in general in Hebrew. You know, many times in English, we use adjectives and we're not so particular about the exact nuances of the adjectives. But in Hebrew, each term, especially if it's being used in the Chumash, or it's being used in the Navi, or it's being used in the Talmud to explain a concept, or in the Mishnah, these terms are significant, and we try to unpack what does each one mean. And if Rashi uses two of the same sounding terms, you know, it seems like they're a similar idea, but he uses both of them. He doesn't just say one of them. Then that indicates that they are different. And so we want to understand how they're different. And of course, they're going to be similar because they're being used to describe and define the term kavod rosh, but they are going to be nuanced. So the maamarim is going to talk about what do they mean and how are they different from each other? What quality is that we want to develop in ourselves before we daven? And believe it or not, of course, I'm sure you're all going to believe it. This is going to be very connected to what we're doing in the Shabbos class, of course. Like it's, anyway, just an interesting bit of information. Okay, so Rashi says, we're going to define kavod rosh. It means hachna'a and shiflus. So now the Rebbe is going to define what does hachna'a mean first, and later on he's going to go on to shiflus. And hachna, the idea of submissiveness, which is it's a translation, so it's not a perfect translation of the word hachna, is going to be connected to physical things, and he's going to explain that now. So hachna is the more appropriate term in a physical context, and shiflus is the more appropriate term in a spiritual context. So that's basically the answer in a nutshell, right? As we've talked about before, also in maamarim, a maamarim starts with a question or sometimes a series of questions and usually gives the answer right away in a nutshell, and then spends the rest of the time explaining that answer in detail. So here's the answer. The question is, the statement is, we shouldn't daven except with kavod rosh. What does kavod rosh mean? It means, as Rashi says, hachna and shiflus. What does that mean? It means some sort of submissiveness and humility in both a physical and a spiritual context. That's the question and the answer. So I suppose you could all go home if you wanted to now. But I'm not encouraging that because the previous Rebbe is going to elaborate on these ideas in a lot of detail. First, he's going to talk about, he's going to focus more on hachna, then he's going to focus on shiflus, and then he's going to go into application and so on. So hachna and shiflus emerge from different causes. In other words, the submissiveness from a physical cause versus from a spiritual context, those are different causes. Breaking the body and one's physical tendencies brings about hachna. When a person feels physically broken, that develops in them being submissive, being subdued. That's like kind of that's the result of feeling that the breaking of the body and the physical tendencies. What does that mean? When a person is crushed, God forbid, by physical things. For example, when he experiences major difficulties because of his children, earning a livelihood, or health, he becomes subdued. That's a person's experience, right? When he has these kinds of challenges and difficulties, and these three examples are Bani, Chaya, and Wazayne. They're like the three examples, the catch-all examples in general about a person's physical walk on this earth is children, whether, and it could be a variety of things about children. Not having them, and they have difficulties. There's so many different levels of what that could include, a pain associated with that. Earning a livelihood, right? If somebody's having difficulty with earning a livelihood, or health, or any kind of health difficulties, those are all physical. Those are all like physical life difficulties and challenges. And when a person experiences them, he becomes subdued. That's the result of this. This is what happens. He's sort of broken in a certain way, right? He feels crushed because of these physical difficulties, so he becomes subdued. We see this in actual experience. This can occur even to someone who is by nature a tough person, endowed with innate resilience, right? I mean, and resilience has been a real catchphrase in these days, because everybody seems to be experiencing some sort of difficulty in one or all of, or two, or any combination of these areas, especially with global pandemics and things like that going on, and that we all need to build our resilience. So of course we need to build our resilience, and at the same time, our resilience is challenged when we are experiencing challenges in any one or a combination of these areas. And the Rebbe says he doesn't really have to explain it. Even we know it, like we know from our own lives, right? That this can make a person feel subdued, basically, even if he's a tough person. So now he's going to go talk about the concept of being a tough person, a strong person, for a bit before he gets back to this idea of being subdued. So toughness is neither a good trait nor a bad trait, although it is certainly a better trait than weakness, right? It's not innately good or bad, but it is more helpful than weakness. And I was going to talk about what that means and what that entails. There are those who are of a naturally weak temperament. They are weak people. In Yiddish, the term is a schwache Mensch. They're weak. They're just weakness in this context is not physical weakness, but rather weakness of spirit. For example, when such a person wants to do something, his desire is weak. Therefore, even when he actually desires something, nevertheless, he may not actually do what needs to be done to achieve it. He wants it, but he doesn't want it enough to go out of his way to make it happen if it's a difficult thing. I'm sure we can all, at some level, relate to that, right? Both personally and probably with people who we, have interacted with. It's, it's pretty much, we would assume everybody's weak sort of in some area, right? Like some, good water, but not wanted enough to do something, to actually do something about it. But here the Friedrich was talking about general nature. Generally, there are people who fall into these two categories. Specifically, we probably each have areas where we're stronger and weaker, right? But there are people who are generally more weak, and he may not actually do what needs to be done to achieve whatever it is that he says he wants. And even if he does actually do something, his actions are feeble, right? He puts up a little fight, but it's not much, or does a little action, but also not much, maybe not much carry through. Or the opposite, when he doesn't want to do something, his resolve is also weak. Even though he doesn't want to do it, it's easy to prevail upon him to do it, right? Like, no, I don't want to do it. Please, please, please. Okay, fine. Such a person displays the same lack of resolve in everything. Yes and no are all the same to him. So that's a certain type of character that the Friedrich was calling a weak character. So it's in this context, it's not necessarily such a positive thing, right? He doesn't mean easygoing. He just means weak, right? This lack of resoluteness is not due to a lack of understanding. Remember, he's talked about earlier in the first mimer, the idea of understanding something properly, and rather it's due to a weakness of character. He may understand that this is important to do or this is important not to do, but he just can't follow through with it. In terms of understanding, he knows very well what he should and shouldn't want. But because of his weak nature, his resolve is weak, whether to do what he wants or to avoid doing what he does not want to do. So that's his nature. So that's not a very it's compared to having a strong nature, it's more difficult to work with, I guess you could say. By contrast, one who possesses the characteristic of resoluteness, what he wants resolutely, and what he doesn't want, he resolutely does not want. All right, so that's considered to be somebody who has a strong character. Okay, those are the two characters. Okay, however, these are not the main characteristics of a person. This is like the manner in which his characteristics show themselves, right? This is not this by itself doesn't do anything or not do anything. It's how it interfaces with his main characteristics, which is what the previous Rebbe is going to go on to explain now. Nevertheless, weakness and strength of character are merely auxiliary attributes. They implement what the other attributes require, and merely service those attributes that they bring into expression. In other words, those are not attributes by themselves. They're in the Hebrew, it's midas misharsim. They serve the other attributes, right? They are actually in the service of the primary attributes. What are the primary attributes? By way of contrast, the emotions of love and awe are autonomous attributes, whereas weakness and strength of character merely implement. Meaning, when we talk about the soul powers, right? We say that there's the 10 soul powers, which we've talked about before, right? There's the 3 intellectual soul powers, there's the 7 emotional soul powers, and the 7 emotional soul powers have 2 primary soul powers that the rest of them sort of come from, and that is love and awe, ava and yira, chesed and gvura, right? So those are the primary emotions. Weakness and strength help carry out all the emotions, all the attributes, all the midas, either in a weak way or in a strong way. They're not in and of themselves attributes. They're catalysts to bring the other attributes into fruition. So somebody who could be of a loving nature or a more disciplined nature or whatever it is, the way that they bring those attributes out is either going to be in a weaker way or in a stronger way, depending on whether their attributes are coupled with a weak character or a strong character. Does that make sense? Are there any questions?
I just have a comment. I feel like this is so brilliant. I love this because from studying psychology, obviously this is like excellent. I wish I had this in my schooling, but I feel like you can see this in an exaggerated tone. Obviously, that's an obvious way, but I can find this in myself in trying to please, like if I want to please people and they want different things, I start to get a little, because I can be strong and disciplined in things that I am resolved to do, but when it comes to pleasing to people that I care about that don't agree, or in this Ba'al Tshuva situation, this is such a good explanation and it's giving me such chizuk, because just that when you're not used to doing these mitzvot, you've been raised this way, like you want to do it, and then all of a sudden you get into a battle with yourself of laziness or just, I don't even know what it is, like anxiety that you're not going to have lights on Shabbos and you're used to having whatever it is, you just don't have the habits, you don't know them, and they're very strange, and you don't really have the support system because everyone you know doesn't, most of the people you've been raised with don't live this way. So I feel like this is such a chizuk piece because it's kind of mapping out what you just need to strengthen, and that it's not, so you can do this, you know what I mean? Sorry for talking so long, but I think that I'm finding this even in myself here with this growing in mitzvot. So it's great chizuk here.
Well, that's wonderful. And I think I would venture to say that pretty much everyone on this class could relate to what you're saying. So I don't think you were talking too long. You're getting some thumbs up here. I think you're saying very wise words. And I think right, there's the extreme, right? Where like a person, quote unquote, is like has a weak character, or quote unquote has a strong character, or is a strong character is usually how we say it in English, right? And then I do think that we can each find in ourselves, as is in most of Hasidus, there's like the archetype, right? Example, and then there's the way that each thing relates to each of us sort of all the time. So there's definitely a part of us where we could relate to, like maybe in this area we're weak, like you were sharing, maybe in, pleasing people, you suddenly become weak in your own resolve because you don't want to, not displease somebody. But in a mitzvah that you decided to take on, you're going to have a strong resolve because that's your nature, or whatever it is. Everybody can find themselves probably in an area where their midas are being expressed in a weak way, or where their midas are being expressed in a strong way. And for many people, it's like in a work situation versus a family situation, right? That can also happen. Sometimes it's depending on the company that we're in, right? Sometimes with a certain group of friends, we're the strong one, and with a different group of friends, maybe we're the weaker one. Like it can also be like a sliding scale almost, right? Like where are we on the spectrum, and who are we with, and where are they on the spectrum? And that's how it sort of plays out. So I think I think the definitions or the explanations are very helpful to help us center ourselves and recognize, well, what's going on over here? Am I having this quality in a weak way, and I really need to have it in a strong way? So no matter who I'm with and no matter what the situation is, I see that this is the area I have to work on. He's saying that it's interesting, if we turn back a page, toughness is neither a good trait nor a bad one, but it's better than weakness, meaning the toughness by itself or the weakness by itself is not necessarily by itself something. It's because it's that catalyst. But toughness, in English, toughness has a sort of a negative term, like a negative association, but it's not really in Yiddish. The term that he uses, starkheit, which means, I would probably translate as strong, being strong, which has a more positive connotation in English, strength, like strength of character almost, right? That can be very, now of course the person can take that too much too, and then we call that stubborn in English, right? So there's but I think he's saying it's easier to, or it's more desirable to have a certain strength of character, because then when you should do something, you carry it through. When you should, when one knows one shouldn't do something, one doesn't do it. It's easier to work with yourself, with ourselves. It's easier to work if we have that quality of strength. Yeah, but I think that what you said is very true. I don't know. Anybody else has a question or comment?
I sometimes find that I'm doing great, and then the next day, for whatever reason, not so great. So I think there's a lot of, unfortunately, oscillation between the two.
Yeah, that can also be that sometimes we feel like we're stronger and other times we feel like we're weaker. So then the question is, what can we do to strengthen ourselves when we notice that? So again, I guess by defining it and talking about it and naming it, it helps us become more aware of it. So we notice what's going on, like, oh, I'm feeling weak today, so I need to strengthen. I know I need to strengthen myself, instead of just sort of like not even recognizing what's going on and just going about our business, wondering and what's going on with ourselves or something. it gives us a vocabulary to deal with what's going on. So that could also be helpful.
Yeah, so we don't feel buffeted. We don't feel buffeted by circumstances. Talia, it gets easier. Trust me, it gets easier. It really does. What I discovered is that you just do what you have to do, and eventually people respect you for it. People close to you respect you for it. So
Thank you, Malka.
yeah, just keep plugging along, and no, seriously, and it gets easier, because as you begin to define yourself in a different way than the people surrounding you, they do begin to respect you just by
Thank
doing what
you.
you're doing. Yeah.
That's wonderful, Chizuk. I really appreciate that. I think what makes one of the things that I like about this particular definition is that he's saying, is explaining the difference between like love and awe, that those are attributes, and then the way he's saying these other things of strength and weakness, so to speak, are just, those are transient. Those are things that we can like apply or not apply, but the love and awe is the secure part from Hashem in us. And that right there is a good feeling, like, okay, well, even no matter how shaky I am on the light situation or whatever it is, standing up to somebody who I'm trying to, between two family members and they both want different things and you're trying to please them both, whatever it is, to know, especially with mitzvot, I think, to know that your love and awe is there inside you. It's God-given. All you need to do is start working on these other things that are a lower, they're just vehicles, and that makes it seem easier and less, you don't have to bash yourself like that all of a sudden you don't have the love and awe. No, it's there. It's just work on these outer things. And so to me, that's really helpful.
Very well put. Yes. Yeah. It's very hopeful. It's very hopeful. Yeah. And again, it gives us a vocabulary to describe what's going on and to figure out what we need to do next. Like you said, it's not about beating ourselves up. It's about noticing, oh, today I feel weak in this area or in this situation or something like that. But you're right. It doesn't, the soul power is there. We need the catalyst to bring it out and apply it. So, and that's what we're all working on honestly, for our whole lives, Yeah. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Okay, this won't be your last chance, but we'll go on. Okay, so of these two attributes, strength and weakness of character, strength is a more positive trait than weakness. See here, he says strength, not toughness. So it reads nicer in English too. Because weakness is such that even when a person does what he's supposed to do, it is in a weak-willed manner. With strength of character, however, when a person does what he has to do, he does it with resoluteness. So again, I guess, I think we can experience, let's say, even on a small level, right? When somebody does something with enthusiasm, right? And like excitement and energy, that feels like they're doing it with strength rather than with weakness. It's more exciting, it's more enlivening. If we're on the receiving end of something, it feels better, right? It's like the person is bringing their whole self into the experience. It doesn't have to be loud. I'm saying everybody, that's not that of loud or quiet, but that feeling of like their presence in their action. And when we can do the same, we probably feel better about it too. However, even a person who, so now we're going back to this idea of Hachma and Shiflos, like we sort of digress to talk about this idea of strength or weakness, right? But now we're going back to this idea that, remember he said in the beginning, even a person who has a strong character, and then he started talking about what the difference is between a strong or weak character, but even a person who has a strong character could feel crushed when they face challenges in physical arena of children, livelihood, or health, right? So, however, even a person whom God has endowed with a resolute nature and innate resolve so that all his matters, he conducts himself with great resoluteness. When God crushes such a person, God forbid, in material matters with poverty or illness, for example, that person becomes subdued, right? It's the natural result from experiencing difficulties, is a feeling of being subdued. Now, of course, depending on the person and depending on what the challenge is, it could be less subdued or more subdued. You know, there's degrees also. It's not like just the same for every person or every situation, right? There's difficulties, there's different levels of difficulties as well, right? So, and there's different levels of resolute natures. So every combination is going to be individual, but the concept is that when a person is experiencing challenges, physical challenges in these three areas, which are very catch-all for, you know, any part of life pretty much, the result is that they become subdued. Even if they're resolute in their character naturally, they still become subdued. So this is, in some of his maamarim, the previous Rebbe would write summaries at the end of each chapter. So this is a summary, his own summary. Hachna'a, which is one of those terms that we're not supposed to pray except with hachna, is physical brokenness, while shiftless, that's the second term of Kovid Reish, right, is spiritual lowliness, which he hasn't defined shiftless yet. They are two soul powers that emerge from different causes. The cause of hachna is brokenness due to crushing material circumstances that affect one's children, health, or livelihood. This is true even of those who are naturally endowed with a strong nature, which is a tremendous advantage in certain things. However, when God crushes such a person in material matters, God forbid, he becomes subdued. Okay, so that's the first section of the mimer. Any questions or comments before we go on to the second section, where he is actually going to review the definition of hachna and talk a little bit about shiftless? Any
I
questions?
have a question.
Yeah.
Boy, do I understand this lately.
Oh,
We all do, don't we?
sorry.
We've all gone through some stuff, haven't we, at our level? Well, thank God. But is there part of subdued which is actually humility? So it's a nisayon that can teach us something about humility.
Every test can teach us something about humility. I mean,
Does subdued mean that in a good way at all, or no?
yeah, this is not a negative character trait. In fact, it's something we're supposed to inculcate in ourselves before we daven. So it's not negative. It's a natural result of hardships, which, like you said, for the last 2,000 years, we've been in exile. Everybody's experienced hardships at some level or other in their life. So a person could respond to hardships by becoming subdued, right? Like becoming humble, however you want to put, humble is really going to be the word that's used for the spiritual subduedness, I guess you could say, which is not a bad character, which is not a bad thing. We're not supposed to daven unless we have some of this quality in us. We have to figure out, what does that mean? How does that apply here? But versus maybe somebody who feels entitled or angry or bitter or something like that, angry, bitter, not, we're going to see the word bitter is going to be used differently in this mimer later, but as a result of hardships, right? So for example, when it talks about Yaakov says, Yaakov, when Hashem gave him lots and lots of goodness, he felt humbled by the goodness, like, oh my goodness, I hope, I don't deserve all this goodness. I hope Hashem is not gonna not allow the other things that have to happen in my life to happen because I have so much goodness now, or something like that, right? So I go back to that beautiful phrase that from the luncheon that we had with Rabbi Friedman. I don't remember how many years ago it was right now, but he says we have to accept the difficulties with graciousness and the good things with gratitude, right? That's inculcating this idea of being subdued as opposed to being entitled, let's say. Okay, that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Okay, so section 2 of the maamarim, we're on page 106, right? So now, so the cause of shiftless is also brokenness, but not the crushing of the body materially. Right? We're gonna compare and contrast kind of shiftless and hachna. Since crushing material circumstances brings a person to hachna'a, the subdued fate, not shiftless. As the Mitzler Rebbe said, that's the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, a poor person needs no deep contemplation of his misfortune. The moment he recalls his indigence without reliving it and deeply analyzing it, he weeps from the depths of his heart with great bitterness and becomes outwardly, literally, physically subdued in a way that is recognizable in all of his movements. That's hachna that we were just talking about, right? That when a person, in fact, it's interesting, the previous Rebbe wrote something called Klali Hachinuch V'Hadracha, which is the rules, I guess you could say rules of education and guidance. And he discusses in there how different types of people who come from different kinds of circumstances need to have different values emphasized to them for their spiritual growth. It's not a one size fits all. A poor person needs to be built up because they naturally feel broken, whereas a wealthy person needs a little bit of humility because they naturally feel entitled. So you don't want to mix up what you're trying to, you want to make sure each person gets what they need for their own spiritual growth. So here he's saying that shiftless is a brokenness, but it's not from physical problems. That person, the poor person, doesn't need to contemplate deeply anything to feel broken. He just looks around his life and he feels broken and he feels subdued. And that's like a natural thing. But the breaking that leads to shiftless, this spiritual humility, is not a physical crushing, right? We're talking about a spiritual thing now, but rather a spiritual one that crushes a person so he becomes absolutely humbled. So we're in English, they're using the term subdued for the physical and humbled for the spiritual. He comes to regard himself as inferior to everyone. He sees everyone else, even a simple person, as a more worthy human being, mer mensch, than himself. Meaning he recognizes that the good in other people, and that's what I was saying about what we're doing in the Shabbos class, right? About Reb Mordechai, who was looking at the simple Tehillim sayers and how they were on such a high level, and they're on a higher level than he is, even though he's this great Torah scholar, and they are not learned, but because of their simplicity and their davening and so on, right? Like that idea, he was experiencing shiftless when he was talking to himself about that and crying, right? That's what he was experiencing, that they were greater than he was. This means that in addition to seeing the good in another and the bad in himself, he magnifies both the other person's virtuousness and his own faults and lacks. Meaning a lot of life's interpersonal challenges come from doing the opposite. Magnifying other people's faults and exaggerating our own virtues, right? That's where most of the issues start. So here, for the person to be humble, they're magnifying the other person's virtues and their and his own faults, meaning it keeps him humble, which is right? That's exactly what Reb Mordechai did in last Shabbos, in the chapter we're up to last Shabbos, right? We're talking about their great virtues and his great faults. And we were all like, you're beating yourself up, really, you're not that bad, right? And then, of course, and the Baal Shem Tov came to him in a dream and told him he wasn't that bad. But he felt that was an extreme case of humility, that he magnified their virtues and his faults to a point where he was crying and weeping, and right, that was an extreme example. He ponders this deeply and it crushes him greatly from within, causing him to become absolutely humbled. So again, this can also be just like the previous idea of Hachna, this can also be, so to speak, a sliding scale, right? Not everybody has to experience this as intensely as Reb Mordechai did. This lowliness of spirit cannot be recognized outwardly on his person, as it would be in the case of Hachna, the product of physically crushing circumstances. Rather, it is a state of spiritual dejection. He becomes meek. This spiritual dejection makes the person embittered. Now, embittered is going to be defined very carefully here. So it doesn't sound right in English, but embittered in English is almost like entitled and angry and like that. That's not what this word means. So mariros is the term in Hebrew, has a very specific definition in the Tanya, and that's how we're using it, and it's going to be explained in a few lines. So again, there's the difference between Hachna and Shiftless. Hachna is a subduedness that comes from a physical challenge. Shiftless is something that comes from a spiritual. He uses the word crushing here. Crushing is very strong in English, but a spiritual crushing, that the person recognizes other people's benefits and their own faults. Now, he's going to explain, and I see even the translator here feels the need to explain this term embittered because it doesn't sound right in English. So does the Rebbe Rayatz proceed? Remember I said Rebbe Rayatz is the way that in Hebrew, the way that you say Friedrich Rebbe, it's an acronym of his name, Rebbe Yosef Yitzchak. Rebbe Rayatz proceeds to explain that there's a vast difference between bitterness of spirit, mariros, which is the term that we just used here, that it brings to bitterness, which is actually a good quality, and depression, which is atzvos, which is a bad quality. The former energizes a person to act and change things. The latter causes a person to sink into despair and hopelessness. This is explained at length in the Tanya, right? That bitterness, it spurs a person to action. It's like it bothers them. They want to do something about something. They're upset about something, so they want to do something about it. Atzvos which is we're translating here as depression, is basically a tactic of the Yetzer Hara, trying to get a person to feel so badly about themselves or a situation that they just basically want to stay in bed and pull their covers over their head and not deal with anything. So the way that a person can tell if they're experiencing atzvos or mariros is whether it's a springboard for growth and action, or whether it's rather an excuse for not doing anything because they're not good enough to do anything, because they're not worth anything, do anything, right? So the idea is, even with Reb Mordechai, that feeling, how he was feeling so terrible about himself, it didn't make him want to give up on life. It made him want to do tshuva. It was a springboard for growth and action, to take action and do something better. So it's okay. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay, it's going to explain it now in the mimer as well. So now there's depression. Again, the Friedrich is going to segue to make sure that everybody understands what does he mean that spiritual dejection makes the person embittered, which is a good thing. This is a good thing, but it could be mistaken for depression, which is a bad thing. So now there's depression, atzvos, which is a negative trait and brings the person no benefit, right? Beating up of self and just feeling badly about self to the point where, I'm no good, I can't do this, everything I try is no good, I blah, 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 all that negative self-talk, it just is not helpful. On the contrary, atzvos is destructive, right? We know that. Because when a person is depressed, he lacks any motivation to act. That's exactly what the Yetzer Hara wants. The Yetzer Hara does not want people to act, right? Because when we act, we bring more godliness into the world. That's not what it wants. So it wants to make us give up and feel like we're no good, we can't ever do anything right. This mistake we made is not just a mistake we made, it's like axiomatic of our entire selfhood, and we can't do anything right, so we might as well not do anything at all. That's a Yetzer Hara, that's atzvos. He automatically sinks into despair, believing that nothing can be done. Thus, he languishes in a bad state. Right? That's atzvos. However,
I just have a question, excuse
Yeah.
me. How much of that could be considered mental illness rather than Yetzer Hara?
so you're talking about like clinical depression?
Well, clinical depression, or a person who feels that to the extent that they literally don't do anything and have
so-
negative self-talk constantly.
Right. So that's a very interesting and important question. And I don't know that I can answer it authoritatively, but I will share that people who have, let's say, clinical depression and need medication for, balancing hormones and things like that, once they have that balanced, and probably with some therapy as well, some kind of therapeutic support, can get themselves out of it. They might need some kind of medication to help themselves, depending on their situation. People who don't have a clinical depression, but just very negative self-talk, can also be helped with a therapist and a mashpia, meaning there could be a sort of a psychological support and a therapeutic support and a spiritual support happening at the same time that can help a person overcome it. I don't think what we're talking about right here is a clinical depression that requires medication. We're talking about, this person messed up. I don't know, they messed up in some way. They whatever it is, they ate something not kosher after, keeping kosher for 3 years. They didn't help themselves, and they ate something that wasn't kosher. And then as a result of that, they're telling themselves they're never any good. See, they can't keep kosher, they're not resolute in their decisions, blah, blah, blah. That's the type of thing we're talking about, which the Alter Rebbe says is a tactic of the Yetzer Hara. That piece.
Okay.
So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. But with bitterness, mariros, when a person is bitter about their terrible spiritual state, this dejection of spirit is not at all noticeable outwardly on this person. The way depression just gets a person to stay in bed and not do anything, right? But mariros, on the contrary, it can be that outwardly everything is normal. See, that's another difference, because, right, one of the concepts in mental health is, everybody experiences everything that eventually could become too extreme, in nature, that becomes a mental health concern, right? So it's all about FID, right? Frequency, intensity, duration, and whether it interferes with day-to-day living, right? People could have, so to speak, depressive thoughts about themselves, right? But if it's not that frequent, it's not that intense, it doesn't last that long, and it doesn't affect their day-to-day living, that's not a depression. That's like normal human stuff that's going on, and we have to overcome it. So here, right, he's saying, like, a person who experiences mariros, it's not a mental health concern. Actually, it's a actually healthy thing that helps. The person is living his normal life. However, he has that little push to do better and say, there's a story actually of a chassid of I think it was of the Alter Rebbe, who was overheard in the Bais Medrash at night arguing out loud, saying, "You despicable, whatever," basically yelling at his Yetzer Hara, "You despicable creature, you expect the chassid of the Alter Rebbe to do something so terrible, get out of here," basically. And he's yelling at his own Yetzer Hara, like, you low life, you can't convince me to this, that, and the other thing, because I'm a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. I can't behave that way. So, So he's not subdued at all in a physical sense. Rather, the lowliness involves only his spirit. He's functioning. In other words, nobody's concerned that there's a clinical depression over here. He's fully functional, but like Mordechai. So that night he was crying and doing tshuva, but that doesn't mean he didn't get up the next morning and go to shul, right? He died the next morning. The difference between hachna, okay, so that's like the end of that idea. So now we're going to apply it. What does it mean in our service of Hashem? So the difference between hachna and shiflus in regard to one's divine service, the avodah, is that Divine service with hachna, the subjugation that stems from breaking the body, leads to avoda expressed in actual conduct. Such a person fulfills mitzvahs and conducts himself with good character traits in actual practice. He is meticulous in every mitzvah, making sure that it is performed at the right time, according to the law and in the best possible manner. Similarly, regarding character traits, he has good character traits and is scrupulous about them. That's the outcome of hachna, of feeling subdued physically. He puts his effort into his service of Hashem. However, the avodah of shiflus that stems from a crushed spirit doesn't only affect the person's actual behavior. In addition to the fact that his fulfillment of mitzvahs, a manifestation of good character traits in his conduct, is in a totally different manner, with fervent vitality, chayas. His avodah is also in matters of understanding, grasping godliness, godly understanding. In other words, it affects not only his action and his character traits, it affects also his chayas and his understanding. In other words, working on these things, basically, the idea, I guess you could say, that there's nothing as complete as a broken vessel, right? It talks about this idea. There's a beautiful line, this from a secular therapist, I think, that something about it's good to be a broken vessel because that's how you let light in. It's, it's through the cracks that the light comes through. That's a very beautiful way of saying something that talks about in Tanya about broken heart is the fullest vessel that there is the most complete vessel that there is. Because what does it mean? Again, not in a way of negative self-talk or depression. I think the previous one made that absolutely clear. Just in a matter of being subdued and humble, that enables a person to behave and develop good character traits and a deeper understanding of things. It makes them more of a mensch, basically, when a person has these qualities of humility. These two matters, hachna and shiflus, are the kavod rosh that one must have before praying. In other words, before beseeching God for our needs, a person should have this type of subdued and humble approach to Hashem and asking for what he needs. In the summary, I'm just going to read the summary. It says, shiflus is a more profound brokenness than hachna, but the reason for it is not a crushed body, but a crushed spirit. The person becomes bitter and dejected, but again, not depressed, by his spiritual state and condition. He feels that everyone else, even a simple person, is better than he is. That's how he feels. That enables him, again, because it's not depression, enables him to grow and enables him to look at other people and learn from them. It enables him to develop himself because he doesn't feel, right, it says a full vessel you can't pour anything else into a full vessel. We have to be emptied in order to receive. So this brokenness of spirit spiritually enables the person to learn from other people and learn their character traits and learn more information because he feels like he doesn't know everything, so he's open. Depression, atzvus, is a negative trait that can lead to despair, but hachna is an avodah that leads to fulfilling Torah mitzvos and good character traits. Bitterness, marirus, leads to fervent vitality in fulfilling Torah mitzvos and good character traits. So again, we're not talking about depression. It's very important to emphasize. We're talking about bitterness, which again doesn't mean that entitled type of attitude that it could mean in English. This concept is a very specific concept that it talks about in the Tanya. This bitterness means like you're like juiced up, like something's bothering you. You're like you're moving and shaking. You're moving yourself because something's bothering you. You're not complacent. That's kind of what it means. You feel badly about something and it shocks the person out of their complacency. That's the exact opposite of depression, right? So these two qualities are the two qualities that we want to have, like we want to develop in ourselves before we daven, basically. Are there questions or comments?
I just want to keep this straight. So shiflus is humility, right?
I mean, that's how they're translating it here. Humility in front of other people, feeling oneself to be lower than other people, that they have better character traits than you do, like that type of a feeling. It's a spiritual thing. Versus achna is like the physical hardships a person feel. I remember I had a mashpia who showed me this, actually it's a quote from Reader's Digest, where she said, every day I say a prayer, God make me a potato, because everything, no, I'm sorry, God make me, one second, I'm confusing it. Yeah, God make me a potato. No, I think I'm confusing. I'm sorry. I'm gonna take back what I was just about to say. But the idea is that we want to we want to become softer from the results of the difficulties that we go through, and have a more open heart.
I think it's potato and egg, isn't it?
It is potato and egg, but it's a different lesson. So it's the
Okay.
wrong lesson for this message right now. Or maybe it is. No, maybe it is. Maybe it is the right message, right? It is, right? God make me a potato, because an egg becomes harder when it's boiled and a potato becomes softer. Anyway. So, all right, any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody. I want to remind everyone should have gotten an email about Sunday night, the program with Michal Gaynor and the music and the Elul Farbrengen. If anybody can come, you're invited. And have a good week.
Thank you for a great
Thank you, Chaya. Thank you.